September 15th, 1943. Hearne, Texas. Prisoner of war camp number 7. Wilhelm Becker sat at a long wooden table in the mess hall staring at his breakfast tray. He was 28 years old, a lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, a believer in the Reich, a man who had spent 3 years fighting for Germany across 2 continents. And in front of him were 3 strips of bacon, real American bacon. He had never seen anything like it. In Germany, pork meant thick cuts boiled until gray, heavy, dense, practical food for practical people. But this was different. These strips were thin, almost translucent in places, crisped at the edges, glistening with fat that caught the morning light streaming through the mess hall windows. The smell hit him like a physical force, smoky, rich, sweet somehow, but also salty. It filled his nostrils and seemed to coat the inside of his mouth before he had even taken a bite. It was nothing like the ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns that passed for breakfast in Berlin. Nothing like the sawdust bread his mother wrote about in her letters. Nothing like the watery turnip soup he had choked down on the frozen fields of the Eastern Front. This was real food, food that somebody had actually cared about while cooking it. Wilhelm's hands shook as he picked up his fork. Around him, the mess hall buzzed with the quiet sounds of 200 German prisoners of war eating breakfast. The clink of metal on metal, the scrape of chairs on concrete, low conversations in German, punctuated by the occasional word in broken English. Some men ate quickly mechanically, as if the food might disappear if they did not consume it fast enough. Others ate slowly, savoring every bite, their eyes closed in something that looked almost like prayer. Wilhelm did neither. He just stared. 3 months ago, he had been a prisoner in a British camp in North Africa. 3 months ago, he had been loaded onto a ship with 2,000 other captured Germans and transported across an ocean to a country he had been trained to hate. 3 months ago, everything he knew about the world had still made sense. 3 months ago, Nazi propaganda had told him that Americans were degenerate savages, that they would torture prisoners, that their food was processed garbage filled with chemicals designed to weaken the body and corrupt the soul, that American values were fake, a thin veneer over a nation built on slavery and exploitation. 3 months ago, he had believed every single word. Now, sitting in this Texas prisoner of war camp, holding a fork over 3 strips of bacon, Wilhelm Becker felt the first hairline cracks forming in the foundation of everything he thought he knew. He took a bite. Time seemed to slow down. The crispy texture gave way under his teeth with a satisfying crunch. Then came the taste. Salt and smoke and fat all combining into something that his brain could barely process. The bacon almost melted on his tongue, releasing flavors that built and shifted with each second. Sweet, savory, rich beyond belief. It was not just food, it was an experience. Wilhelm's eyes closed involuntarily, and then to his absolute horror, tears began to stream down his face. Not because he was hungry, though he was. Not because he was homesick, though he was that too. Not even because the bacon tasted good, though it tasted better than anything he could remember eating in years. Wilhelm Becker cried because in that single bite, in that explosion of flavor and richness and care, he realized with absolute certainty that he had been lied to. If they lied about this, he thought, what else did they lie about? His hand lowered the fork back to the tray. The other prisoners near him had gone quiet, watching him with expressions that ranged from concern to understanding. Some of them had clearly experienced this same moment, this same terrible, wonderful realization. Klaus Hoffmann, the young corporal from Bavaria who slept in the bunk next to Wilhelm's, reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. "It gets everyone eventually," Klaus said quietly. "For me, it was the Coca-Cola. For Hans over there, it was the mattress on the first night. For you, it's the bacon." Wilhelm wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, suddenly aware that he was sitting in a room full of men crying over breakfast. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like something essential inside him had cracked open and could never be sealed again. "I don't understand," Wilhelm said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They told us Americans were cruel, that they would torture us, that their food was poison. But this is better than anything my family has eaten in Berlin in 2 years." Klaus nodded slowly. "I know. That's the point, isn't it? That's when you start to wonder what else they lied about." Wilhelm looked down at his tray again. Besides the bacon, there were scrambled eggs. Real eggs, fluffy and yellow. not the powdered substitute that German soldiers had been eating since 1941. There was toast made from actual wheat bread, soft and white, spread with real butter. There was coffee, dark and strong, and smelling of actual coffee beans, not burnt grain. This was a meal that most Germans back home would consider a feast, a special occasion meal, Christmas morning perhaps, or a birthday. And here in this American prisoner of war camp, it was just Tuesday breakfast. The American cook, a heavy-set sergeant with graying hair and a thick Southern accent, was moving along the serving line checking on the food. When he saw Wilhelm's face still wet with tears, he paused. "You all right there, son?" the cook asked. His name tag read Morrison, Sergeant Frank Morrison. Wilhelm did not know what to say. How do you explain to your captor that his kindness is breaking you more thoroughly than any torture could? How do you tell him that a simple breakfast has shattered your entire worldview? The bacon, Wilhelm managed finally, his English heavily accented but understandable. It is very good. Sergeant Morrison's weathered face broke into a smile. First time having American bacon, I reckon. Wilhelm nodded. Well, hell, that ain't even the good stuff, Morrison said with a laugh. That's military-grade bacon. You should taste what my wife makes back home in Tennessee. She cures it herself, smokes it over hickory wood for 12 hours. Now that'll make a grown man weep. He said it as a joke, but Wilhelm was not sure whether to laugh or cry harder. The casual abundance of it all, the offhand way this American sergeant talked about his wife smoking bacon at home as if it were the most normal thing in the world. As if food could be art. As if eating could be pleasure and not just survival. Morrison must have seen something in Wilhelm's expression because his smile faded into something gentler. More understanding. You're a long way from home, aren't you, son? Berlin, Wilhelm said quietly. I am from Berlin. That's being bombed pretty regular now, I hear. Wilhelm nodded. His mother's last letter, which had taken 3 months to reach him through the International Red Cross, had described the raids. The endless sirens, the nights spent in shelters, the morning walks through neighborhoods that no longer existed. His younger sister Greta, only 16, working 14-hour shifts in a munitions factory because all the men were gone. My family is there, Wilhelm said. I do not know if they are alive. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that Wilhelm would remember for the rest of his life. He reached over the serving counter and gripped Wilhelm's shoulder, the same gesture of comfort that Klaus had made moments before. War's a terrible thing, Morrison said. Terrible for everyone. But you're safe here, you understand. We'll feed you, keep you healthy, treat you right. That's our job. That's what Americans do. Wilhelm looked up at this American sergeant, this man who should have been his enemy, and saw only genuine kindness in his eyes. It was too much. All of it was too much. He nodded quickly, unable to speak, and Morrison gave his shoulder one last squeeze before moving on down the line. Klaus waited until the sergeant was out of earshot before speaking again. It's going to keep happening, he said. Every day, you're going to see something else that doesn't match what we were told. And every day, it's going to get harder to hold on to the old beliefs. How long have you been here? Wilhelm asked. 2 months. I was captured in Tunisia, same as you, but they sent me here on an earlier transport. Klaus took a bite of his own bacon, chewing thoughtfully. The first week I was sure it was all propaganda, that they were fattening us up for something, making us soft so we would talk. But then you realize that this is just how they are. They actually believe in treating people decently, even their enemies. Wilhelm looked around the mess hall with fresh eyes. The building was clean, well lit. The tables were sturdy wood, the benches comfortable enough. There were windows along one wall, real glass windows that let in natural light. The floor was swept. The air smelled of food and coffee, not sweat and unwashed bodies in despair. This was a prison. He was a prisoner of war, and yet this place was nicer than the barracks he had slept in while serving the Reich. I saw a Negro guard yesterday, Wilhelm said quietly, lowering his voice, even though most of the prisoners around them did not speak English. He was giving orders to white soldiers, and they obeyed him. Klaus nodded. I've seen that too. The Americans have Negro officers here. Can you imagine in Germany we were told that Negroes in America were treated like animals, slaves? But I've watched them. They wear the same uniforms as the white soldiers. They eat in the same mess halls. Some of them have higher ranks. It does not make sense, Wilhelm said. No, Klaus agreed. It doesn't make sense if what we were told was true. But what if what we were told wasn't true? What if almost none of it was true? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Neither man wanted to touch it directly. To truly examine that question was to risk everything. Their entire understanding of the world, their loyalty to the fatherland, their belief in the cause they had fought for, their faith in the leaders they had followed. Wilhelm picked up his fork again and took another bite of bacon. It tasted just as good as the first bite, maybe better now that he was not crying. He chewed slowly, letting the flavors fill his mouth, trying to memorize this moment, this feeling, this precise instant when everything he thought he knew began to fall apart. Across the table, Sergeant Hans Muller was glaring at both of them. Hans was a hardliner, 35 years old, a career soldier who had joined the Nazi Party in 1933, back when it was still dangerous to do so. He had fought in Poland and France and Russia. He had iron gray hair and eyes like flint and absolutely no patience for doubt. "You two sound like cowards," Hans said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "This is exactly what they want. They feed you bacon and give you soft beds, and you forget who you are. You forget you're German soldiers. You forget that we're at war." Wilhelm met his gaze. "We're prisoners, Hans. The war is over for us." "The war is never over," Hans snapped. "Not until Germany wins, and she will win. The Fuhrer has secret weapons, new technology. The Americans and British and Russians will be crushed, and when that happens, you'll wish you had stayed loyal." "Loyal to what?" Klaus asked quietly. "Loyal to people who lied to us about everything." Hans's face went red. "Watch your mouth, farm boy. That kind of talk is treason." "Treason against who?" Klaus pressed. "Against a government that's 3,000 miles away, against leaders who sent us to die in North Africa while they sat safe in Berlin, against a system that told us Americans were subhuman monsters, when the truth is they're treating us better than our own officers ever did." For a moment, Wilhelm thought Hans might actually hit Klaus. The older sergeant's hands were clenched into fists, his jaw working soundlessly. But they were in a room full of American guards, and even Hans was not quite angry enough to start a fight that would land him in solitary confinement. "You're both dead to me," Hans said finally. "You're traitors, and when we get home, you'll answer for it." He stood up abruptly, his breakfast only half eaten, and stalked away to sit with a group of men at the far end of the hall. Other prisoners watched the confrontation with wary eyes. Wilhelm could see the camp dividing itself in real time. Those who clung to the old beliefs, who insisted that this American kindness was just a trick, just propaganda, and those who were beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they had been on the wrong side all along. Klaus let out a long breath. "That could have gone better." "He will make trouble for us," Wilhelm said. "Probably. But what else can we do? Pretend we don't notice, go on believing lies just because admitting the truth is painful." Wilhelm looked down at his tray. The eggs were getting cold. He picked up his fork and took a bite. They were good, properly seasoned, cooked with care. He tried to remember the last time he had eaten eggs that were not powdered, not reconstituted from some chemical mixture in a military kitchen. He could not. "My mother told me something before I left for the war," Wilhelm said slowly. "She said, 'Wilhelm, promise me you will not believe their lies. Americans will try to corrupt you. They will try to make you doubt Germany. Promise me you will stay strong.' And what did you say?" "I promised her I would not believe the lies." Wilhelm took another bite of bacon. "But I am starting to think the lies came from a different direction." Klaus nodded. "So what do we do?" It was the central question. Was it not? What do you do when you realize that everything you fought for might have been wrong? When the enemy you were trained to hate turns out to be kinder than your own leaders? When the country you were supposed to destroy treats you with more dignity than the country you were supposed to die for? Wilhelm did not have an answer. Not yet. But he knew that he could not go back, could not unknow what he now knew, could not unfeel what he had just felt. The bacon had opened a door in his mind, and once opened, that door could never quite close again. "We watch," Wilhelm said finally. "We pay attention. We see if this kindness continues or if it was just for show. And if it continues, if this is really how Americans are, then we remember. We make sure that when we go home, whenever that is, we tell the truth about what we saw here. That could be dangerous, Klaus said, if Germany wins the war. And if Germany loses, the question sat heavy between them. Neither wanted to voice the possibility out loud, but it was there all the same. The Allies were advancing in Italy. The Eastern Front was bleeding Germany white. The bombing campaigns were intensifying. The war that was supposed to be over in months had dragged on for 4 years and showed no signs of ending in German victory. What if they lost? What if the 1,000-year Reich lasted only 12 years? What if everything they had fought for turned out to be ash and lies? If Germany loses, Klaus said quietly, then men like us men who learned the truth here might be the only hope the fatherland has. Wilhelm nodded slowly. It was a heavy responsibility, almost too heavy to contemplate. But it was also in a strange way liberating. For the first time since his capture, he felt like he had a purpose beyond simple survival. Beyond just waiting out the war behind barbed wire. He would watch. He would learn. He would remember. And when the time came, he would tell the truth no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. An American guard walked past their table young and fresh-faced, probably not even 20 years old. His uniform was clean and well-fitted. His rifle was slung casually over his shoulder. He nodded politely at the prisoners as he passed, and some of them nodded back. Wilhelm watched the guard disappear through the mess hall doors and thought about the propaganda posters he had seen in Berlin. The ones that showed Americans as brutish, violent subhumans. The ones that promised German soldiers they would be tortured if captured. The ones that insisted American culture was decadent and weak and doomed to collapse. And then he thought about the bacon. The real genuine kindness in Sergeant Morrison's eyes. The casual way that Negro and white soldiers worked together. The clean barracks with actual mattresses. The medical care he had received when his wounded leg got infected on the transport ship. The American doctor who had treated him with the same care he would have given one of his own men. Every single thing the propaganda had told him was backwards. Inverted. The Americans were not the monsters. The question that Wilhelm did not quite dare ask himself yet, the question that lurked at the edges of his consciousness like a predator in tall grass, was simple and terrible. If the Americans were not the monsters, then who was? But he was not ready for that answer. Not yet. It was too big, too devastating. So instead he focused on the immediate, on what he could see and touch and taste, on the evidence in front of him. He picked up the last strip of bacon and ate it slowly, committing the taste to memory. This was the moment his old life ended and something new began. This was the moment Wilhelm Becker stopped being a true believer and became something else. Something more dangerous to the Reich than any Allied soldier. He became a man who had tasted freedom and now knew the difference. The bacon was only the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, Wilhelm Becker felt his entire worldview disassemble piece by piece, like a building being carefully demolished brick by brick, until nothing remained but the foundation. And even that foundation was starting to crack. October arrived in Texas with temperatures that still climbed into the 90s during the day, though the nights were finally cooling off enough that sleeping in the barracks became almost comfortable. Wilhelm had been assigned to a work detail on a local cotton farm, along with Klaus and 30 other prisoners deemed trustworthy enough to leave the camp during daylight hours. The farmer's name was Robert Hayes. He was 55 years old, weather-beaten and sun-darkened, with hands like worn leather, and eyes that seemed to see right through whatever front you were trying to present to the world. He wore the same clothes every day, faded denim overalls, and scuffed work boots, and a sweat-stained cowboy hat that looked like it had been alive since before Wilhelm was born. He drove a pickup truck that was held together mostly by rust and prayers, and he worked harder than any man his age should have been able to work. Wilhelm learned all of this in the first week. What took longer to learn was that Robert Hayes had lost his son at Pearl Harbor. Robert Jr. had been 22 years old, a Navy ensign on the USS Arizona. He had died in the first minutes of the attack, incinerated in his bunk by the explosion that tore the ship in half. Robert Sr. had received the telegram on December 8, 1941, and his wife had died 6 months later. Grief eating her alive from the inside until her heart just stopped one morning while she was making breakfast. Wilhelm did not learn any of this from Robert Hayes himself. The man never mentioned it, never brought it up, never used it as a weapon or a reason to treat his German prisoners with anything other than basic human decency. Wilhelm learned it from Jake Thompson, one of the young American guards who accompanied the work details, who told the story in a hushed voice during a water break, making sure Robert was out of earshot. "And he doesn't hate you guys?" Wilhelm had asked, genuinely confused. Jake had shrugged. "He says hating you won't bring his boy back. Says you didn't kill Robert Jr. any more than he killed your brothers or fathers or whoever you lost. Says it was the war that killed everyone, and hating each other just feeds the war." Wilhelm had stood there in the hot Texas sun holding a cup of cool water that Robert Hayes had provided from his own well, trying to process this information. This man should have hated him, had every right to hate him, had more reason to hate Germans than perhaps any person Wilhelm had met since being captured. And yet every morning when the truck arrived to transport the work detail to the farm, Robert Hayes greeted them with a nod and a gruff, "Morning, boys," as if they were hired hands and not enemy prisoners of war. He worked alongside them in the fields, showed them the right way to pick cotton so you did not damage the plants, brought out jugs of cold water every hour, and made them drink even when they protested they were fine, because heat stroke don't care if you're fine, it'll drop you just the same. On Wilhelm's fifth day at the farm, he made a mistake. He was working too fast, trying to prove something to himself, or maybe to Robert Hayes, and he stumbled in a furrow and went down hard. His ankle twisted beneath him with a pop that he felt more than heard. The pain was immediate and shocking. Robert Hayes was beside him in seconds, moving faster than a man his age should have been able to move. "Don't try to stand," Robert ordered, kneeling in the dirt. His hands were gentle as he examined Wilhelm's ankle, probing carefully. "Not broken, I don't think, but you've twisted it good. Jake, get the truck." "I can work," Wilhelm said through gritted teeth, the pain making him speak in German before he caught himself and switched to English. "I am fine." "Son, you can barely stand, and you think you're gonna pick cotton, use your head." Robert's tone was firm, but not unkind. "Jake's bringing the truck around. We'll get you back to camp, have the doctor look at it." "But the work," Wilhelm protested weakly. "Work'll still be here tomorrow. Your ankle won't heal any faster if you're stupid about it." They loaded Wilhelm into the back of Robert's truck, and the farmer himself drove him back to Camp Hearn, leaving Jake to supervise the other prisoners. The ride was quiet for the first few minutes, Wilhelm sitting in the passenger seat with his throbbing ankle elevated on the dashboard, Robert steering with one hand and adjusting his hat with the other. Finally, Robert spoke. "You remind me of my boy," he said quietly, eyes on the road. "He was always pushing himself too hard. Always trying to prove he was tough enough, strong enough, good enough. I kept telling him he didn't have nothing to prove to nobody, but he wouldn't listen." Wilhelm did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "I know what you're thinking," Robert continued. "You're thinking I should hate you. You're thinking I got every reason in the world to treat you like dirt, work you till you drop, take out all my grief and rage on you German boys." "Yes," Wilhelm admitted quietly. Robert was silent for a moment, navigating a turn onto the main road. "I thought about it," he said finally. "After Mary died, after I got through the funeral and came back to an empty house, I thought real hard about hate. Seemed like it would be easier, having something to be angry at, someone to blame. And I realized hate's like poison. You take it thinking it'll hurt the other fellow, but really you're just poisoning yourself." Robert glanced over at Wilhelm. "You didn't kill my boy. Some Japanese pilot who's probably dead himself by now, he did that. But even him, he was just following orders, same as Robert Jr. was, same as you were." "I believed in it," Wilhelm heard himself say. "The war, the cause. I believe we were right. And now," Wilhelm looked out the window at the Texas landscape rolling past. Flat fields and distant horizons, in a sky so big it seemed impossible. "Now I do not know what I believe." Robert nodded as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. "That's good. Not knowing means you're thinking. Thinking means you might learn something. It's the men who are certain, who know they're right about everything. Those are the dangerous ones." They drove in silence for another mile before Wilhelm spoke again. "In Germany, I was told Americans were weak, soft, that you had no discipline, no courage, no real values, that your country was falling apart because of Jews and Negroes and immigrants. And what do you think now?" Wilhelm looked at this Texas farmer who had lost everything and still found it in himself to be kind to his enemies. "I think I was lied to about many things." Robert pulled the truck up to the camp gates and waited while the guards checked his papers. The thing about lies, he said, is they're easy to believe when they tell you what you want to hear. When they make you feel special, chosen better than other folks. Truth's usually harder, usually asks more of you, but it's still truth, and in the end, that's all that matters. The gates opened and Robert drove through, pulling up to the camp hospital building. He helped Wilhelm out of the truck, letting the younger man lean on his shoulder. "I will work harder when I return," Wilhelm said, "to make up for today." "You'll work the same as everyone else, no more, no less," Robert replied firmly. "I don't need heroes, son. I just need honest work from honest men. You think you can manage that?" Wilhelm met his eyes and saw something there that he had not seen in a very long time. Respect, not the forced respect of military hierarchy, not the fear-based respect that Nazi officers demanded. Just simple human respect offered freely, asking nothing in return. "Yes," Wilhelm said, "I can manage that." Robert tipped his hat and climbed back into his truck. Wilhelm stood there on his good foot, watching him drive away, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. This man had every reason to hate him and chose kindness instead. How many Germans would have done the same? How many of Wilhelm's own countrymen would have shown such grace to an enemy who had killed their child? He did not want to answer that question. But the answer came anyway, unwanted and undeniable. Not many, not many at all. The camp doctor, a brisk American captain named Wilson, examined Wilhelm's ankle and pronounced it a moderate sprain. He wrapped it tightly, gave Wilhelm a pair of crutches, and ordered him to stay off it for a week. "But I must work," Wilhelm protested. "You must heal," Wilson corrected. "The work will wait. Army doesn't need you crippling yourself permanently just to pick cotton." It was the same sentiment Robert Hayes had expressed, and Wilhelm was beginning to see a pattern. Americans seemed genuinely concerned about the welfare of their prisoners, not because they were weak or soft, but because they actually believed that people had value, that even enemies deserve basic human dignity. The concept was so foreign to Wilhelm's experience that he almost could not process it. He spent the next week in the barracks during work hours, hobbling around on his crutches, reading books from the camp library. The Americans had provided an astonishing collection. German literature, of course, though carefully vetted to remove Nazi propaganda, but also American books, English classics, even some recent bestsellers that had been donated by churches and civic organizations back in the States. Wilhelm found himself drawn to books about American history. He read about the revolution, about farmers and shopkeepers taking on the British Empire because they believed in an idea. He read about the Civil War, about a country tearing itself apart over the question of slavery and somehow stitching itself back together afterward. He read about the westward expansion, about pioneers heading into unknown territory with nothing but hope and determination. And he began to understand something that German propaganda had never told him. America was not built on racial purity or ancient bloodlines or mystical connections to the soil. It was built on an idea, the idea that all men were created equal, that they had inherent rights that no government could take away, that freedom was not granted from above, but demanded from below. The idea was imperfectly applied. Wilhelm could see that. The books did not hide America's sins, the treatment of Native Americans, the legacy of slavery, the ongoing struggles with segregation and inequality. But the key difference was that Americans seemed to believe their country should live up to its ideals even when it failed to do so. They saw the gap between what America claimed to be and what it actually was, and they worked to close that gap. In Germany, there was no gap. The Führer was always right. The party was infallible. To question was to betray. To doubt was to be weak. Wilhelm thought about this a great deal during his week of enforced rest. He thought about it while eating meals that continued to be better than anything his family was getting in Berlin. He thought about it while lying on his mattress, which was more comfortable than any bed he had slept in since childhood. He thought about it while watching the American guards joke with each other, relaxed and casual in a way that German officers never were. Klaus visited him every evening after work, bringing news from the farm. "Robert Hayes asked about you," Klaus reported on the third day. "Wanted to know if your ankle was healing properly. Said to tell you he's saving the easy work for when you get back." "That is kind of him. He's a kind man." Klaus sat down on the bunk across from Wilhelm. "Do you know what he did today?" One of the new prisoners, Johann Schmidt, the kid from Hamburg, he started crying in the field. Just broke down. Homesick, I guess. Missing his mother. Robert stopped. The whole crew gave us all a break. Sat with Johann for 20 minutes just talking to him. Couldn't understand most of what Johann was saying. Kid was sobbing too hard, but Robert just sat there and listened anyway. Wilhelm shook his head slowly. His son died at Pearl Harbor. I know, Jake told me. Klaus was quiet for a moment. How does a man lose his son to your enemy and then comfort your enemy's children when they cry for their mothers? I cannot understand it. I think that is the point, Wilhelm said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it. I think the point is that we were trained not to understand it. We were trained to see weakness where there is actually strength, to see softness where there is actually courage. It takes no courage to hate your enemy. It takes tremendous courage to show them kindness. Klaus nodded. You sound different. This week off has changed you. The bacon changed me. The week off just gave me time to think about it. And what have you concluded? Wilhelm gestured to the books stacked on the small table beside his bunk. I have concluded that we were on the wrong side, not just of this war, but of history, of morality, of basic human decency. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and irreversible. To say such things out loud was to cross a line. Hans Muller and his group of hardliners would have called it treason, would have reported them to the camp authorities, or worse, would have found a way to punish them directly. But Klaus did not flinch, did not argue. He simply nodded slowly. I have been thinking the same thing, he admitted, but I was afraid to say it, afraid that speaking it would make it real. It is already real, Wilhelm replied. We just did not want to see it. That night, lying in his bunk, Wilhelm took out the letter he had been composing in his head for days and finally put it to paper. He wrote to his mother, choosing his words carefully, knowing that the letter would be read by censors on both sides. But he had to try, had to plant some seed of truth that might survive the long journey back to Berlin. He wrote about the camp, about the food and the medical care, and the kindness of the guards. He wrote about Robert Hayes, though he did not mention the man's son. He wrote about reading American books and learning American history, and then in the final paragraph, he wrote the thing that mattered most. Mother, I know you told me not to believe their lies, and I have not. But I am beginning to think that perhaps the lies came from a different direction than we were told. I am beginning to think that the real corruption is not here in this camp, but back home in Berlin. I do not expect you to believe me. I would not have believed me 2 months ago. But please keep yourself safe. Take care of Greta, and know that when I come home, I will not be the same son who left. I will be someone who has seen the truth, and I cannot unsee it. He signed the letter, folded it, and put it in the outgoing mail bin. Whether it would ever reach Berlin, he did not know. Whether his mother would understand what he was trying to tell her, he could not say. But he had written it, and that felt like progress. When Wilhelm returned to work the following week, his ankle still tender but functional, Robert Hayes greeted him with a nod and handed him something wrapped in cloth. What is this? Wilhelm asked. Open it. Wilhelm unwrapped the cloth and found himself holding an old cowboy hat. Not Robert's personal hat, but one that had clearly seen years of use. The leather sweatband was stained and cracked. The brim was shaped by countless hands into the perfect curve. It smelled of sun and sweat and honest work. Can't have you getting heat stroke, Robert said gruffly. Texas sun'll cook your brain if you're not careful. That was Robert Jr.'s hat. Figured he'd want it used rather than sitting in a closet. Wilhelm stared at the hat in his hands, unable to speak. This man was giving him his dead son's hat. His dead son who had been killed by Germany's ally. This made no sense. This violated every rule of war and honor and vengeance that Wilhelm had been taught. And yet here was the hat, solid and real in his hands. I cannot, Wilhelm managed finally. Sure you can, just put it on your head. Works the same way a German hat does, I reckon. But your son, Robert's expression softened slightly. My son would have liked you, I think. He always did want to travel, meet people from different places. He believed in treating folks right no matter where they came from. So I figure the best way to honor his memory is to keep doing that. Treating folks right, even the ones I'm supposed to hate. Wilhelm put the hat on. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for him all along. He felt the weight of it settle onto his head, felt the shade it cast over his eyes, felt the impossible gift of it pressing down on his skull like a crown. He tried to speak and found that he could not. Tried to thank this incredible man and discovered that there were no words in English or German that could possibly suffice. Robert Hayes seemed to understand. He clapped Wilhelm on the shoulder, the same gesture of comfort and respect that he had used before, and nodded toward the cotton fields. Come on then, work won't do itself. And I want to teach you boys about the rotation schedule we're going to use next season. You'll be gone by then probably, but knowing how to properly rotate crops is knowledge you can take anywhere. And so Wilhelm Becker, former lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, devoted believer in the Third Reich, went to work in a Texas cotton field, wearing a dead American sailor's cowboy hat, learning agricultural techniques from a man who had every reason to kill him and chose instead to educate him. The transformation that had begun with bacon continued with cotton and kindness and the slow, steady erosion of everything Wilhelm had once believed about the world. By the time November arrived and brought with it the astonishing gift of Thanksgiving dinner, Wilhelm was barely recognizable as the man who had arrived at Camp Hearn 4 months earlier. That man had been certain, sure of his cause, confident in his beliefs, secure in his understanding of who was right and who was wrong. This new Wilhelm was certain of almost nothing. But in that uncertainty, in that willingness to question and doubt and reconsider, he had found something that felt surprisingly like freedom. The bacon had opened the door. But it was Robert Hayes who had shown him what lay on the other side. And Wilhelm, stumbling through that doorway with a twisted ankle and a dead sailor's hat and a heart that was learning how to see clearly for the first time in his life, knew that he could never go back. The only direction was forward, toward truth no matter how painful, toward understanding no matter how difficult, toward becoming the kind of man who could accept kindness from his enemy and let it change him, toward becoming impossibly something better than he had been. The war ended on a Tuesday, May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The camp loudspeakers crackled to life at noon, and the commandant's voice echoed across the barracks and workyards and exercise fields, reaching every corner of Camp Hearn with the same impossible message. Germany had surrendered. Unconditionally. The Third Reich was finished. Wilhelm stood in the middle of the cotton field, where he had been working Robert Hayes' hat, shading his eyes from the brutal Texas sun, and felt absolutely nothing. Not relief, not grief, not even surprise, just a vast echoing emptiness where his reaction should have been. Around him, the other prisoners reacted in every way imaginable. Some wept openly, some stood frozen like statues. Some fell to their knees in the dirt. Johann Schmidt, the young kid from Hamburg, who Robert Hayes had comforted months ago, started laughing hysterically until Klaus had to slap him to make him stop. Hans Muller, standing at the far end of the field, turned his back on everyone and stared at the horizon with his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Even from a distance, Wilhelm could see his whole body shaking. Robert Hayes walked over to Wilhelm and stood beside him, looking out at the field full of broken men, trying to process the end of everything they had known. "How you holding up, son?" Robert asked quietly. Wilhelm tried to answer and found he did not have words. "How do you explain that you feel like you are watching yourself from outside your own body, that the news you have been expecting for months still somehow feels impossible now that it has arrived, that you do not know if you are supposed to grieve or celebrate or simply stand here in this Texas cotton field forever, suspended in this moment when your old life ended and your new life has not quite begun?" "I do not know," Wilhelm said finally. "I do not know what I feel." Robert nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's all right. You don't have to know yet. Sometimes it takes a while for big things to settle in your chest properly." "What happens to us now?" "Honestly, I don't rightly know. I imagine they'll send you boys home eventually once they sort out the logistics. Could be months. Could be longer." Wilhelm looked down at his hands, dirt-stained and calloused from 2 years of farm work. "I do not know if I want to go home. The Germany I left does not exist anymore, and I am not sure I want to see what has taken its place." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "You know what I think? I think that's exactly why you need to go back. Because the easy thing would be to stay here, stay in this little pocket where everything makes sense, and you don't have to face what your country became. But Germany's going to need men like you. Men who learn something different. Men who saw another way. I am just one person. What difference can I make? Same difference any person makes. You tell the truth when people want to hear lies. You choose kindness when hate would be easier. You remember that people are people no matter what uniform they're wearing or what flag they salute. Robert adjusted his hat against the sun. That's all any of us can do, Wilhelm. Just keep trying to do right one day at a time and hope it adds up to something. The commandant announced that work details were suspended for the rest of the day. The prisoners were to return to camp. There would be a meeting that evening to explain what happened next. Wilhelm rode back in the truck with the other men squeezed into the bed with Klaus and Johann and a dozen others, all of them silent or speaking in hushed tones. When they passed through the camp gates, Wilhelm noticed something that made his heart sink. The hardliners Hans Muller's group had gathered in a tight cluster near the barracks. There were maybe 40 of them, all standing at attention in their faded uniforms, forming precise military ranks as if they were on parade. Hans stood at the front, his face carved from stone, and as the work trucks rolled past, he began to sing. Deutschland über alles, the old anthem. The one that had been banned, replaced by the Horst Wessel song years ago, but the one that still carried all the weight of German nationalism. Some of the prisoners in the truck looked away, embarrassed or frightened. But Wilhelm watched until they were out of sight, and what he felt was not fear but profound sadness. These men were clinging to a corpse, trying to resurrect something that was not just dead, but had perhaps never truly existed in the first place. And they would probably cling to it for the rest of their lives because admitting they had been wrong was more terrifying than being wrong forever. That night at the meeting, the commandant explained the situation with brutal efficiency. Germany was divided into occupation zones. The country Wilhelm had left no longer existed. In its place was chaos, millions of displaced persons, cities in ruins, a population on the brink of starvation. The camps, all of them, the industrial death camps and the forced labor camps, and the camps whose names Wilhelm had heard whispered but never quite believed were real, all of them had been liberated. The photographs were being shown worldwide. The testimony was being recorded. There would be trials. The commandant did not mince words. You will be going home to a country that will have to reckon with what it did, what it became. Some of you may face charges if evidence emerges of war crimes. Most of you will simply face the reality of rebuilding from nothing. We will begin repatriating prisoners in the coming months, starting with those who have been cleared through the denazification process. Until then, you remain here. Wilhelm looked around the room at 200 German faces processing this information. Some looked relieved. Some looked terrified. Some, like Hans Müller, looked defiant, as if they still believed this was temporary, that Germany would rise again, that the final victory was just delayed. Wilhelm felt only a strange calm. He had already done his grieving, had already faced the truth of what Germany had become. This meeting was not telling him anything he had not already accepted during his 2 years in Texas. After the meeting, Klaus found Wilhelm sitting outside the barracks looking up at the stars. "You are very quiet," Klaus said, settling down beside him. "I am thinking about what Robert said, about going home to help rebuild. Do you believe that men like us can actually make a difference?" Wilhelm considered this. "I think we have to try. What is the alternative? Stay here forever? Pretend we are not German anymore? No, we have to go back. We have to tell people what we learned here. Show them that there is another way." "They will not believe us," Klaus said. "Or worse, they will believe us and hate us for it." "Probably, but we still have to try." They sat in silence for a while, watching the vast Texas sky, the same sky that arched over Germany and America and all the space between. Finally, Klaus spoke again. "I'm afraid, Wilhelm. I'm afraid of what we will find when we go home." "I'm afraid too, but I think Robert Hayes is also afraid every day, and he does not let it stop him from being kind. So maybe that is what courage is, being afraid and doing the right thing anyway." The months that followed were strange, suspended time. The war was over, but the prisoners remained. Camp Hearn became something between a prison and a waiting room. The work details continued because the local farmers still needed help and the prisoners needed something to do. Wilhelm spent his days in Robert Hayes's fields, learning everything the old rancher could teach him about soil and crops and the patient work of making things grow. In July, the camp authorities began showing newsreels. Footage from the liberated concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. They made it mandatory viewing. Every prisoner had to watch. Wilhelm sat in the darkened recreation hall and saw things that his mind wanted to reject as impossible. Mountains of skeletal corpses, living people who looked like animated skeletons, gas chambers, crematoriums, the industrial machinery of mass murder, children's shoes piled high, human hair, gold teeth, the meticulous German record-keeping that documented every single death. He watched it all and felt something inside him break that could never be repaired. When the lights came up, Hans Muller was gone. He had walked out halfway through and several of his followers had gone with him. But most of the prisoners remained sitting in stunned silence trying to process what they had just witnessed. Klaus was crying quietly. Johann had his head in his hands. Wilhelm just sat there numbed, the images burned into his retinas, in his brain, and his soul. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the times he had heard whispers, rumors about camps in the East, stories from soldiers who had seen things, hints and suggestions that something terrible was happening, something beyond normal war. He had chosen not to believe, had told himself it was propaganda, exaggeration, the enemy trying to make Germany look bad. He had looked away because looking would have meant questioning everything, and questioning everything was too frightening. So he had looked away, and people had died. Millions of people. While he had looked away, the guilt was crushing, not because he had personally killed anyone. He had not. His service had been relatively clean, just a soldier following orders, fighting other soldiers. But he had been part of the machine, had believed in the ideology, had supported the regime even if only passively, and his passive support had enabled horrors beyond comprehension. Robert Hayes found him the next morning, sitting alone outside the barracks before dawn, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. "You watched the films," Robert said. It was not a question. Wilhelm nodded, unable to speak. Robert sat down beside him, moving slowly, his old joints creaking. "My boy died at Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. I got the telegram on the 8th, and I was so angry, Wilhelm, so filled up with hate and rage that I thought I might burst from it. I wanted every Japanese person dead, every German too, since you were allied. I wanted revenge for my boy." Wilhelm listened, keeping his eyes on the horizon where the sun was just starting to bleed light into the darkness. "And then about 6 months later, they sent me some of Robert Jr.'s personal effects, things that survived the explosion. One of them was a letter he'd been writing to me, but hadn't finished. And you know what he wrote in that letter?" Wilhelm shook his head. He wrote, "Dad, I know if something happens to me, you're going to be angry. But don't let that anger make you cruel. Don't let it turn you into the kind of person who hates entire groups of people for what some of them did. Remember that I'm fighting for something better than revenge. I'm fighting so that maybe someday we can all just be people together." Robert's voice cracked slightly on the last few words. He cleared his throat and continued. "So when they asked if I wanted German prisoners working my land, I said yes. Not because I'd forgiven anything, but because my boy asked me not to let hate win. And every morning when I see you boys, I choose to honor that request." Wilhelm finally looked at him. "How can you be so good when my country did such evil? Because you're not your country's son. You're just a man who got caught up in something terrible, same as millions of others. And now you have a choice about what kind of man you're going to be going forward. I do not think I can forgive myself. Maybe not. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe that guilt is something you need to carry to remind you never to look away again." Robert stood up, his knees as popping. "But you can choose to do better, to be better, to go home and help build something different. That won't erase what happened, but it's still worth doing." Wilhelm thought about this for a long time after Robert drove away to start his day's work. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand something important. Guilt was not the same as despair. Recognizing that you had been wrong, that you had supported something evil even unknowingly, that recognition was not the end. It was the beginning. The first step toward becoming someone different, someone better. He could not change the past, could not bring back the millions who had died, could not undo the evil that had been done in Germany's name. But he could choose what happened next, could choose to remember, to tell the truth, to never look away again. It was a small thing, perhaps, one man's choice in the face of such overwhelming horror, but it was the only thing he had to offer, so he chose it. In September, Wilhelm wrote another letter to his mother. This one was different, longer, more honest. He told her everything about the bacon and Robert Hayes and the newsreels and the terrible truth of what Germany had become. He told her that he was ashamed, that he was sorry, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for his passive complicity. And he told her that when he came home, he would not be silent. He would tell people what he had learned, would show them that there was another way, would work to build a Germany that could never again descend into such darkness. He did not know if she would understand, did not know if the letter would even reach her through the chaos of occupied Germany. But he sent it anyway because speaking the truth mattered even when no one was listening. The repatriations began in November. Prisoners were called in groups, their names read from lists, their papers checked and double-checked. Klaus was called in late November. Wilhelm walked him to the gates carrying his small bundle of possessions. "I am terrified," Klaus admitted as they waited for the transport truck. "I know. So am I. Promise me something, Wilhelm. Promise me that when you get home, you will find me. We will help each other. We will remember together what we learned here." "I promise." They embraced quickly, awkwardly, the way men do when they are afraid that showing too much emotion might break them completely. And then Klaus climbed onto the truck and was gone, and Wilhelm was alone again. His own name was called on January 15, 1946, 2 years, 7 months, and 10 days after his capture in North Africa. 2 years, 4 months, and 27 days after his arrival in Texas. Robert Hayes drove him to the train station, personally closing the farm for the day to do it. They did not talk much during the drive. Everything important had already been said over 2 years of working together, learning from each other, becoming something that neither of them had quite expected. At the station, Robert handed Wilhelm a package wrapped in brown paper. "Don't open it till you're on the ship," Robert said. "I cannot thank you enough for everything you have done for me. You already have son. Every day you chose to learn instead of hate, that was thanks enough." Robert extended his hand and Wilhelm shook it, feeling the strength and honesty in the old rancher's grip. "You take care of yourself over there. Build something good. And remember what you learned here. I will never forget, I swear it." "I know you won't. That's why I gave you Robert Jr.'s hat in the first place. Knew you were the kind of man who would understand what it meant." Wilhelm touched the brim of the cowboy hat which he had worn every day for more than a year. "Should I leave it with you so you can keep it?" "No, you take it. Wear it when you need to remember that people can choose kindness over hate. That's a lesson worth keeping close." The train whistle blew. Wilhelm picked up his small bag and turned toward the platform. Then on impulse, he turned back and hugged Robert Hayes. The old rancher stiffened in surprise for just a moment, then wrapped his arms around Wilhelm and held on tight. "Thank you," Wilhelm whispered, "for everything, for showing me what kind of man I want to be." "You already were that man," Robert replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You just needed someone to help you see it." Wilhelm boarded the train with tears streaming down his face. He found a seat by the window and looked out at Robert Hayes standing on the platform in his worn overalls and his ancient hat, one hand raised in farewell. The train pulled away, carrying Wilhelm toward the coast, toward the ship that would take him across the ocean toward Germany and home and everything that waited there. But he kept his eyes on Robert Hayes until the old rancher was just a speck in the distance, and then until he disappeared completely. Only then did Wilhelm open the package. Inside was the cowboy hat, carefully wrapped. He had been wearing a camp-issued cap, but Robert had somehow switched them without Wilhelm noticing. Beneath the hat was a letter written in Robert's careful handwriting. "Wilhelm," it read, "this hat belongs to you now. You earned it with 2 years of honest work and honest change. When you get home to Germany, when things get hard, and you are tempted to give up or give in, put on this hat and remember what it represents. It represents my boy who believed in treating people right. It represents you who had the courage to admit you were wrong and become something better. It represents the hope that maybe, just maybe, if enough people choose kindness over hate, we can build a world where our sons do not have to die in wars anymore. Wear it with pride. You have earned that right. Your friend, always Robert Hayes. Wilhelm held the hat in his hands and cried like he had not cried since he was a child. He cried for Robert Jr., who had died at Pearl Harbor. He cried for Robert Sr., who had lost everything and still chose kindness. He cried for Klaus and Johann and all the other prisoners who had learned the same painful lessons. He cried for his mother and sister in ruined Berlin. He cried for Germany and what it had become. And finally, he cried for himself, for the young man who had left Berlin believing in the Reich, for the confused prisoner who had tasted bacon and started to question everything, for the changed man who was heading home to face the ruins of his country and his beliefs. The train carried him east through the American heartland. He watched the country roll past all of it, so vast and rich and alive, and he understood what the real threat to the Reich had been. Not American military might, not their industrial capacity, not even their bombs. The real threat had been their values, the idea that people mattered, that kindness was strength, that truth was worth pursuing even when lies were easier, that you could build a great nation not on purity and conformity, but on diversity and freedom, and the messy, complicated work of treating people like human beings. Germany had tried to build a 1,000-year Reich on hate and fear and the myth of superiority. America had built something greater on the simple principle that all men were created equal, even when they fell far short of living up to that principle. Wilhelm understood now which approach was stronger, which would last. The ship that carried him back across the Atlantic was crowded with returning prisoners, all of them silent or speaking in hushed voices, all of them trying to prepare for what waited on the other side. Wilhelm stood on the deck and watched the Statue of Liberty disappear behind him, and he made a promise to himself and to Robert Hayes and to Robert Jr. and to everyone who had shown him kindness when they had every right to show him cruelty. He would remember. He would tell the truth. He would spend the rest of his life working to build a better Germany, a Germany that could never again descend into the darkness, a Germany worthy of the forgiveness and kindness that had been shown to him in a Texas cotton field by a man who had every reason to hate him. It was a big promise, maybe too big for one man to keep, but it was the only thing he had to offer, so he offered it completely. The ship sailed east into the darkness, carrying Wilhelm Becker home to a country that no longer existed, to become a man he had never imagined being, to build a future that seemed impossible but was necessary anyway. And on his head, he wore a cowboy hat, a reminder of bacon and kindness and the truth that had set him free.